Okay, yeah. As Eniko said, so I'll be talking about degrowth today, giving introduction. But actually, to understand degrowth, we also have to understand growth first. So um, you probably know these kind of pictures you can see online on the television. If people talk about economic activity, about GDP, and especially because of Trump's tariffs at the moment, there has been a lot of talk about the economic situation and about growth and GDP. We get things like this, right? We get talks about how much growth there has been regarding national economies, if an economy is stagnating, so if there's no growth in a system where you want growth, and then the ideas of, okay, how much growth there really is. And if we look at growth historically, we can see that economic growth actually started in 1945 or 1950, this time after the Second World War. So some people say, okay, we have to look at 1945. Some people say 1950, but it's more or less the same. So the situation after the Second World War. And this is where you can see at this graph, this is really where growth kicked off. So you had growth, countries becoming growth based economies after the Second World War. And you can see the orange line here, that's Switzerland, as one of the countries, of the Western countries, where there has been a lot of growth historically and still is at the moment. But if we look at this graph historically, we can see actually economic growth is rather a new phenomenon. So it started about 1835, 40, where it starts getting bigger. So basically, when the Industrial Revolution started in the United Kingdom, then came over to Germany and France. This is where economic growth started, and then took over in other countries. And there you can see this growth getting bigger, but when it really kicked off is after the Second World War. But if we talk about economic growth, we first have to define actually what economic growth is. So economic growth is GDP growth. It's overall economic growth. That's something you use, you can equate it with that. And GDP, as the gross domestic product, is the value of goods and services produced domestically and traded on the market per year, minus all intermediate consumption. So, for example, if you buy a bread at the bakery, the value of the bread is part of the GDP, but the flour which was used to bake the bread isn't anymore, because otherwise you would count the flour twice in the bread and as a raw material. So the definition of economic growth then is increase in gross domestic product. So basically, this means GDP growth is economic growth means GDP growth. So value of goods and services produced domestically and traded on the market per year, an increase in this. And I always like to use the ladder as an example when talking about economic growth or GDP growth, because if you think about the definition I just presented, it basically counts all goods and services. So, for example, if you buy bread at the bakery, let's say with this example, you can argue, okay, this is useful. You eat the bread, you need something to eat. If you would like the bread, or if you would like to eat bread, you go to the bakery and buy the bread. But in the end, it's about going up the ladder. So GDP growth is going up the ladder, but it doesn't really say if you want to go up the ladder, because if you buy the bread, this is part of GDP. But if we have a car accident, people go to hospital, you have to buy a new car. This is also part of the GDP. So It's about economic activity. GDP measures economic activity, but not actually what is useful and not what we would like to have in an economy, but basically just economic activity. So if you think of the ladder, I like to use the ladder because, or refer to the ladder as GDP growth, because if you think of a ladder, if you go up the ladder, you usually use the ladder to do something, right? You maybe lean it against the wall to look over the wall, and then you have the basically as a means to an end. You use the ladder to look over the wall. But things have changed with economic growth because economic growth is no means to an end anymore. It's about economically, we have to go on the ladder more and more and more. So people tell you if we have to go up the ladder because it increases well-being, we need economic growth. That's why everybody is frustrated at the moment if there's a recession. But as with going up the ladder, we also need energy and material. So going up the ladder again and again and again, or not going down again, just we keep on going up the ladder. This needs energy and material. So you can't build a ladder without having wood, and you need energy. You need to eat something to go up the ladder. And this is basically physics. We know this is true. But people nonetheless tell us, okay, we can go up the ladder, but we don't need energy and material. We don't need more energy and more material. And actually, by going up the ladder, we get more happier. We get more happy. We get happier. It increases our well-being. And this is basically what we can look at here. So on the left side, this should display the ecology and energy and material. On the right side, the well-being. So if we go up the ladder, people tell us, or the majority of people, media, politicians, economic actors say us, okay, we can have growth, we can go up the ladder without having ecological disasters, without needing more material and more energy. And on the right side, it can actually increase our well-being. We can be happier with this. But there are two issues with these two things I would like to talk about on the next slides. The first thing relates to the growth and ecology part, or growth and environment or nature, no matter how you name it. So we think about the ladder again. We need to go up. We keep on going up the ladder. This is our GDP growth. And then, especially in politics, people tell us, well, we can go up the ladder, we can grow by having sustainable growth, by having qualitative growth, but having green growth. So there are so many words you can think of, politicians came up with to actually link growth with sustainability. But if you compare these three terms now, you can easily see all of them are linked by growth. So obviously growth is so important. We cannot think of a future which is not based on growth. We need growth. Obviously, we need to make it sustainable. That's why we need to put a word in front of it, but we do need growth. And then there are so many plans about people saying, okay, we've got this plan. How do we make green growth? And then the EU publishes reports are saying, okay, green growth strategy, sustainable growth strategy, and the like, the World Bank, OECD. So these major economic political players are actually working on these topics and have been working on these topics for years. And in my opinion, this meme is summarized this quite well. So if you look at these reports, they try to implement certain figures and show, okay, we can make growth green. And they have formulas, they have data showing, okay, this is actually possible. But if we talk about green growth or sustainable growth, so in the end about growth that is somehow sustainable, we actually need 5 points, or 5 points have to be met to actually talk about sustainable or green growth. I stick to green growth now because this is like the term which is used most often, but as I try to implicitly or explicitly show you now, it doesn't really matter if you talk about green or sustainable growth. So anyway, 5 points would be needed that you can actually talk about green growth. And these are related to decoupling. And this is a concept which is very important. That's why I would like to explain it in more detail. So if you look on the upper side of the graph, the orange line, this should display economic growth. And why is this going up exponentially? Because economic growth is always exponential growth because of the definition I showed you before. You always compare to the year before. You can also compare to the to 3 months before or half a year before. That doesn't matter. Usually you compare to a year before. And because if you always compare to the year before, growth increases exponentially. And in Western economies, usually you want to have from economic policy growth of about 2% per year. That's basically like the aim. So let's assume you have these economic growth rates of 2% or 1.5, whatever. You want to have less environmental consumption, which means environmental consumption means all of the materials we take from the environment, resources, and everything we give to the environment, like emissions or CO2 emissions. So if you have economic growth, you produce 1 franc, 1 Swiss franc, or $1. If you use less environment than 5 years before or 10 years before, you have relative decoupling. So our economy has become more efficient. But as you can see with the graph of the relative decoupling, you still have an increase in environmental consumption. Growth is just increasing faster than the environmental consumption, but you still have an increase in environmental consumption. But what we need is actually absolute decoupling, as you can see on the lower scale, lower line. So we need economic growth, and the absolute environmental consumption would be decreasing. This would be then relative decoupling compared to absolute decoupling. But what we actually need is environmental consumption being below the threshold of the planetary boundary. So in science, you call this sufficient absolute decoupling. And what does this mean? As you can see with the turquoise line, that the absolute decoupling has to be quite fast and quite strong. So to stay within the planetary boundaries, and as you probably know, 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries have already been crossed. So it's really about having this strong absolute decoupling, the sufficient absolute decoupling. And this is the first point of the 5 points I mentioned, which would need to be fulfilled if we can actually talk about green growth. We need, as the second point, decoupling from all environmental pressures. So it doesn't matter which pressure you look at. Usually people talk about CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, but it has to be a decoupling from all environmental pressures. So from air quality, or like air pollution, water pollution, resource consumption or resource use. So all of the things you can actually think of, they are all part of this environmental consumption. And all of these environmental pressures have to be part of the decoupling. We need to have a global focus, which means it doesn't matter where the goods are produced. For example, in Switzerland, 2/3 of the CO2 emissions, only the CO2 emissions, are actually produced externally, and then the goods are imported to Switzerland. That's why it's very important to look at the imported emissions imported environmental consumption as such, as a whole, and not only look at the goods produced in Switzerland. That's why you need a global focus. So in the end, it doesn't matter where the goods are produced. If we consume them in Switzerland, they have to be part of our footprint. So you need a global focus, as the third point. The fourth point is a sufficient pace. So it doesn't matter if we achieve this decoupling in 100 years, we have to achieve it as fast as we can. Because especially if we look at CO2 emissions, climate change is irreversible. If we have a heating of 2.5 or 3 degrees, we can't turn it back. So it has to happen quite fast. And the fifth point is it's important to have no recoupling, which means not to have an absolute decoupling or sufficient absolute decoupling for 1 or 2 years and then having an increase in the absolute environmental consumption again. So this decoupling has to be stable. So these are the 5 points which need to happen that we can actually talk about green growth. And actually, this has never happened so far anywhere in the world. So if you hear about green growth in the media by politicians, you have to check what they are actually talking about. Are they only talking about CO2 emissions? Are they only talking about goods produced in Switzerland and not taking the imported emissions into account? Are they maybe only looking at a certain time period of 2 years where there has been a recession, and usually in recessions because of the not happening, because of decoupling not happening, you have drops in environmental consumption. So it's really important to check what do people talk about, politicians, media, what do people talk about if they talk about green growth, because we have never seen this so far anywhere. And this is scientifically proven. So basically, this is something we can summarize. We're still waiting for growth to become green. But obviously we need to hurry. We need to be quite fast. So this is very important, that we always keep in mind that it is somehow a situation where we have a lot of time pressure. And if people talk about, we can probably have green growth in 10 or 15 years, that's just not sufficient in the sense that climate change is happening now, biodiversity degradation is happening now. We can't wait for solutions which might happen in the future, right? So if you have a disease, you want a medication now. You won't go to a doctor who's tell you, you've got cancer. I'll give you medication in 10 years because then we will probably have this medication. This is just totally unrealistic and not useful. So this is the one side of the ladder, right? We go up the ladder. A ladder needs materials to be built. A ladder needs energy, because if you go up a ladder, you need energy to go up the ladder. That's the one side. We know this ladder needs energy and material. Growth needs energy and material. That's just the one side. The other side is the point that people keep on telling you, you actually need to go up the ladder. We need GDP growth because it increases our well-being on an individual level and on a societal level. And this is actually also not true, but this is the term we always hear. Growth leads to prosperity. And you maybe heard about the Eastern paradox. This was named after a US economist in the 70s, Richard Easterlin, who already in the 70s looked at this nexus, looked at, okay, if we have GDP growth, a certain amount of GDP per capita in a country, does this actually increase life satisfaction? Because that's the thing we always hear, right? And this has been the narrative for decades already. And he showed that this is actually not true, because happiness or life satisfaction in scientific terms only increases to a certain point, and then it drops actually, or stagnates. And this is a study from 2019 where two researchers looked at this relationship again. So on the axis, you see GDP per capita, and on the y-axis, you see life satisfaction. So you just ask people how satisfied are you with your life, and these different dots, they stand for different countries. And as you can see, life satisfaction is quite low in the countries where GDP per capita is less than $15,000, $20,000 per year. Then it increases. So about 45,000 GDP per capita that's where a lot of countries are and where life satisfaction has increased. And then later on, even though you have a higher GDP per capita, life satisfaction actually doesn't increase. In some countries, it actually drops again. So how do we explain this? It's basically about in countries where GDP per capita is low, people are lacking basic needs, housing, nutrition, water. And then if GDP per capita increases, this usually means income increases. And this then also means, okay, people can afford the basic necessities, and that's why their life satisfaction increases. But later on, it seems like if you have more and more money, life satisfaction doesn't increase. So you need these basic needs, basic wealth, you can also call this, that people tend to become satisfied. And then you can also look at this relationship with life expectancy, which is a kind of more objective relationship if you link it to GDP per capita. And there, interestingly, you see quite similar developments, where GDP per capita is quite, in countries where this is quite low, life expectancy is low, and then it increases. But later on, in countries which have quite high GDP per capita, this doesn't actually mean life expectancy is higher. And this actually leads me to my next slide, because you can then obviously ask, okay, if GDP per capita doesn't really indicate how old we are, what wealth basically, which is one part of wealthy countries, that usually you can think of wealthy countries where people get older, right? You can ask the question, okay, what are actual wealthy countries and what do they depend on? And this is a study from two researchers from the UK who looked at countries in the West and looked how low or high is the income inequality in these countries. So it's only about income inequality and not wealth. And then they made an index of health and social problems. And this index contains, I think, about 15 different elements. The obesity rate in countries, also life expectancy, the crime rate in countries, teenage pregnancy. And what they then found is really interesting, because they found that in countries where income inequality is high, people are more obese, crime rates are higher, you have more teenage pregnancy, and all the like. You can basically summarize it with, if income inequality is higher, the index shows that the life situation is worse for the people. And you can turn it around saying when income inequality is low, the index is low. People are more healthy, they are older, there's less crime. And what's really interesting with this study is that these benefits, they apply to all social groups in countries. So all social groups, no matter if you're socioeconomically on the lowest scale, so if you have less income or higher income, you always benefit from less income inequality. If there's less drug use, less crime in a country, or also the people who have high incomes benefit from this. So obviously we can see, okay, GDP is no good measure for when talking about well-being. And this has become in the past years also a focus by more and more people. This is a report which was published in 2024 by the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, who published a report who actually asking, is our obsession with economic growth fueling a global mental health crisis? Which is actually quite interesting, also linked to the graphic I showed you before. So if we know, okay, growth is actually no good sign or no good measure for prosperity. So people tell you we need to go up the ladder and you become happier. And we know, okay, this is not actually true. What is then actually creating prosperity and what is needed for that? And this is where researchers came up with different concepts, and the social foundation, which is basically really the foundation which people need, that we can talk about a good life for all. That's like a term which is often used in degrowth research. You need these elements. So everybody needs shelter, so a house, food, personal networks, social justice, and the like. So this is, if we talk about what all people need, that they can have a good life, this is the basis. And then obviously we need to ask the question, okay, if economic activity should be a means to an end, so we need economic activity to achieve something, we can ask the questions, what do we want our society to look like, and how can the economy help us to achieve this? And that's where I like to use the picture of a platform. So compared to the ladder, we always have to go up in the sense of we always need more economic growth. We need to create a platform. And on this platform, we have all the people of a society. And on this platform, all of the social needs, of the social basis, of the things I showed you before are actually met. So we need economic activity to reach this platform. So degrowth then, as a summary, actually means, okay, we need to have an economy or economies within the planetary boundaries, which respects the ecological goals on the one hand, and on the other hand, reaching all of these 11 social elements I showed you before. And this is then, if you talk about degrowth, this is basically the platform. The platform respects the planetary boundaries on the one hand and achieves the social basis for all of the inhabitants of a society. So what are then the key points of a degrowth society? So the aims, ecology and the social sphere I showed you before. The key points of a degrowth society are that society is not existentially dependent on economic growth. So that's independent of growth. So there wouldn't be a policy to increase economic growth. That growth-dependent sectors in economies are restructured to become growth-independent. And that energy and resource consumption is aligned with sustainability goals. So if you can actually make this question or show this example now quite nicely. So at the moment, we have maybe Trump's tariffs will lead to recession. And what do policymakers try to do? They try to fuel economic growth again, that we don't get a recession. And usually energy and resource sustainability goals are usually pushed aside because everything is focused on economic policy and achieving more and more growth. But in degrowth society, there wouldn't be a growth requirement, but there also wouldn't be a growth ban. You would just stick to the sustainability goals. But because I showed you decoupling is unrealistic, never happened so far, it's quite unrealistic that we would have economic growth in degrowth society. But there wouldn't be a ban. You would just have strict sustainability goals. But what's really important to note in this sense is that you can't be agnostic about GDP growth, because people would then say, or often people tell me, if I, at this point of the presentation, or if I discuss with them, they would say, well, okay, it makes sense. We just need to stick to the sustainability goals, but why then talk about GDP? Why talk about economic growth? It's because so many sectors are dependent on economic growth that policymakers are just so focused on these sectors so that if there is no growth, they would try to do everything to achieve this growth again. So as for now, if policymakers are afraid that there's going to be a recession, they will try to implement policies which are actually fueling economic growth. So you can't be agnostic about economic growth, because if you put the sustainability goals next to the economic policies, policymakers would, next to GDP growth, policymakers would always choose GDP growth because you have so many growth-dependent sectors. And these central areas are areas of society, area of politics, and the economy. And as I already said before, a lack of growth in these sectors leads to existential crises. For example, on the job market, you have job loss. If you look at consumption, less consumption means less production, and you basically have this kind of circular crisis coming. So this is also what I already mentioned. So as a result, then policymakers will do everything they can to avoid such crises. So they pursue growth policies, and they always collide with climate and environmental policies. So that's why you have to turn it around. We need independence of centralist sectors, of the growth-based sectors, to actually really achieve a degrowth society. And this is so important to know, because now you always hear people talking about, if people talk about recession, also at the moment, to say, oh, well, what Trump is doing, isn't that degrowth? No, that's a recession. That's if we don't have growth in a growth-based society, in a growth-based economy, that's a recession. But a degrowth society would be a precise and detailed restructuring of growth-based sectors. And there are many areas dependent on growth. So these are some social areas I listed now. You can look at the old age provision, the labor market, as I already mentioned, or companies. They are all dependent on growth. And how can you make them growth independent? There are different ideas. For example, on the healthcare market, which is at the moment quite focused on curing symptoms and diseases. It's about how can we make a healthcare system independent of growth, that the healthcare system doesn't actually only come in when people are sick, but how do we build a society, an economy where way less people actually become unhealthy. So it's also talking about mobility politics, mobility policies. In car-free cities, people usually walk more. They use their bike more often, which is beneficial for their health. We know this from science. So it's already having health promotion and prevention. And then obviously having a healthcare system which is not based on profit, but which is organized it's a non-profit organization, or organized non-profitly, in the sense that you don't have companies which really try to sell more and more medication. On the consumption field, it's about promoting sufficiency, so really buying less and producing less. And this is important to have it on a public and on a private level. These are just two examples from two sectors. And then you can always look at degrowth policy proposals, which means they are just more detailed, where you can actually look at, okay, what are policy proposals in different sectors, what can actually be done to achieve degrowth. These are now 10 examples, which were published 10 years ago, but they are actually still important to look at. And some of them seem quite unrealistic, but others have actually already been implemented in some cities or some sectors already. For example, if we look at number 8, reducing advertising, in the French city of Grenoble, they have banned a few years ago all advertising on public space. And why? Because we know from research that advertising leads to more consumption. Consumption drives more production, drives growth. Then it's also about having a green tax reform. That's number 4. This is linked to the issue that at the moment, resource and energy is quite cheap in Western countries, but labor is quite expensive. In Switzerland, this is especially the case. And this leads them to the situation that often it's cheaper to buy new products, which are based on resource and materials, than to repair products, because repairing products are based on human labor way more. Obviously, you also need human labor to produce new things, but you usually need more human labor to repair things and less materials and energy. So you basically have to turn this around. Human labor has to be taxed less, and energy and materials and resources have to be taxed higher. And then obviously also number 10, we have to abolish the use of GDP as an indicator of economic progress. So you can still have GDP, right? You can still measure this, as I defined on one of the first slides. It's just a measure on the goods and services which are part of the market, but they can't really show what is useful and what isn't useful. And all of the things which are not part of the market are actually also not part of GDP, but you can still have it as an indicator, right? But it's just important not link it to economic progress and well-being, because as I've showed you throughout the presentation, it is not true. And that's why you need to get rid of this GDP as an indicator of progress or wealth or well-being. Okay, I stop for now. I'm happy to take questions.